What's up, sculptors? Welcome back to the studio. Today we're going to begin another unit, a little study on sort of anatomical sculpture. We're going to take a crack at something that artists have been doing for a very long time, and it's going to kind of really slow us down in the studio. We're going to use a little bit different kind of clay. We're going to be using a polymer oil-based clay that will allow us to work over a long period of time and not have to worry about drying out. Before we even get to clay, we're going to be sort of doing a bit of anatomical study, and we'll wire ourselves up what's called a sculptural armature that will not only give our clay sculpture a bit of structure and support it as it's standing, but it will also kind of help us work out proportions and the sort of biomechanics of the human form. Now this is, like I said before, it's not anything new. Artists have been kind of trying to represent the human body for a very, very long time. But we'll take a look at a couple of artists and a couple of ways in which they approached the human body along the course of this study that will sort of help frame not only what you're seeing out there in the world as art, but also how you might approach your own piece. To start today, let's actually take a look at somebody who you're going to recognize immediately, but maybe you haven't thought very much about. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is probably most well known as a painter. If you know the name, but you can't really pin down the work, think one of the most recognizable paintings in the entire sort of Western art world. Probably, you could just say all of the kind of museum art world. The Mona Lisa. Right? He's probably most famous for his paintings, but what I want you to start thinking about, and I've got this really great kind of text, is kind of a compendium of a lot of his work over the entire course of his career while he was doing different things in different places, everything from sort of studies to his architectural work to his work with studying physics and sort of the scientific possibility of different machines. What I want to sort of talk through at this point is his interest in anatomy. Right, and how we got there. Around the time he was working, so think Italy's 1500s, was the time period called the Renaissance, where people got very interested in well, you kind of imagine it almost like new ideas, but it's actually backwards, right? They got very interested in older ideas, and so as he was doing his paintings, as his contemporaries were making sculpture, the idea of classical sculpture came back to Italy, and so you saw a lot of approaches to making sculpture, to making paintings that would have been familiar as antiquity, right? But now we're going to not only study the old stuff, but see how we can make it even better. And so one of the forms of study, right, that Da Vinci decided to go back and do would be to not only study the body as you can see it in motion, the sort of classical sculptors, think ancient Greek sculpture here. They would have spent a lot of time studying the sort of athletic bodies, think Olympic bodies, the kind of heroic, idealized body forms. Da Vinci is going to take that one step further and actually go, I would say, down to the next kind of granular level of looking at the kind of underlayers, the sort of what you might call the anatomy, the musculature, the bones. And this is oftentimes not even considered the kind of like realm of artistry, right? You might consider that to be more the realm of a physician or a scientist. But what he's doing is he's taking a very close look at why is it that we look this way? How can I more accurately represent the human body in paint or in sculpture? Well, I need to know what's underneath. I need to make very careful studies of all the mechanics, and he, his sketchbooks are just absolutely full of kind of, you could think of it like maybe the evidence of an intensely curious mind, right? A very curious sculptor or a very curious painter who wants to do their work better will kind of spill the banks of their research into other areas, the anatomical sciences, for example. The Vitruvian Man is a very popular illustration. You've likely seen this illustrated on t-shirts or mugs or whatever. I actually prefer a different name for it, the Cosmografia del Mundo, which is sort of like the entire world in one thing, or what you might have heard called a microcosm, right? He spent some of his anatomical studies, right, trying to carefully work out proportions. Now, he wasn't necessarily trying to figure out like the ideal person, the ideal man. Like, we're going to use this little graphic here, this proportional anatomical guide here later, and whoever put it together years ago called it the ideally proportioned male. That's not really what Leonardo da Vinci was up to here necessarily. I mean, anybody who studies his paintings and can understand that he's very aware of the differences between one body type and another. He's not essentially trying to flatten all of humanity along a kind of hierarchy of like the good-looking bodies, the not so good-looking bodies. But what's going on in this, right, is this maybe deep-seated belief or evidence of a curiosity that he's got, that if I really study one thing, intensely study one thing, I may open up entire universes, right? I really like this idea, and it's one of the reasons why we teach all of our art students to draw, and why we'll then spend at least a couple of weeks working out the careful measurements and really carefully studying the proportions and shape and form of the human body. Let's leave Da Vinci alone for a minute. We'll come back and we'll take a look at some other sculptors along the way, and kind of maybe even pick apart what's going on in some of the more famous pieces that you likely have seen, maybe some of the pieces you haven't seen. But for today, we actually got to get down to the work of beginning our piece, because no matter whether your piece will look like this sculptor or this sculptor, for the most part, we're going to begin our anatomical studies in essentially the same way. We're going to build ourselves a little sculptural armature, and that armature will do two main things for us. It's going to sort of perform a practical sort of service of actually giving us some structure, some internal structure inside the clay, so that our clay just doesn't slump down on us. But maybe as important, maybe even more importantly, I want to make sure that my figure is bending and breaking and articulating in the appropriate places. And he's not looking like he's made of jello. If you choose to sculpt according to one of these things that I've given you, I've provided a couple of different body types. I'm going to work through the sort of simplistic male form here, and we'll see how far along the developmental process we go. If you want to follow along with me, I've provided this handout for you. But if you want to work with other body types, I think that's great. Just even punching into to Google anatomical proportions for sculpture, something along those lines, and you'll probably come up with more of these than you know what to do with. One of the helpful things about the one that I've given you is that I've already pre-formatted it so that we have about an 8-inch tall figure. So if you print it without shrinking the print size at all, we'll all end up with about the same amount, same size figure. Don't go too much taller than that. You really don't have as much clay as you're going to need to kind of do anything bigger than this. You may want to go a bit smaller depending on how complex your form is, or about, maybe like the larger body types are going to use up more clay. Smaller body types are going to use up less clay. Certain types of motion might use more clay. So start to kind of piece through in your head, like, am I interested in sort of depicting maybe like the athletic body in a particularly athletic pose, or some other type of posture or arrangement of the form. For now, though, let's actually just sort of work out our materials. We've got some 1/8-inch wire, about 5 feet of it, that's going to kind of provide the main structure for our piece, and then about 5 feet of 3/32 wire, which we'll use as our wrapping wire. I'll explain that here in a minute. To work with this, the reason I grabbed aluminum wire is, well, a couple different reasons. One is it's very easy to work with your bare hands. You don't need a lot of specialized tools for it. It's not going to get all rusty on us, so I can keep a lot of it around in the studios. But also, it's really dead. It doesn't have a lot of spring to it, and so I can put it in a position and it stays there, which is great. Certain types of spring steel, right, they don't want to go back to those positions. Once they're in a position, they don't like to move very much. Aluminum is much easier to work with in that sense. But there will be some bends along the way that you guys won't be able to do with your fingers, at least not very well, so you're going to need some sort of pliers. I really like a pliers that has a breaker at the back, or you might have called like a wire cutter. This old pair of linesman pliers is sort of a favorite of mine, but I just kind of have a collection here floating around the studio. If yours doesn't have a breaker at the back for cutting the wire, you'll have to find some other tool to do that. These sort of breakers, right, they're kind of like a big beefy scissors in a way. You're not going to cut through the copper so much as actually just kind of snap it, and you need something with a lot of leverage to do that. A scissors just won't do the trick. So you'll need some kind of pliers to do this work, and it doesn't have to be pretty. This is all going to be hidden inside the clay itself. You may also find that a tape measure is sort of a handy thing to have around, because we're going to make a couple of rough measurements here. But even if you don't have one, you can just use your body as measuring as a sort of basic measuring tool. We're not going to get too precise in our measurements today. Finally, as we begin sort of cutting and working with our pieces, the caliper that you have in your kit will be a really handy tool for taking some measurements off your model and bringing it to your wire piece. So let's actually get down to assembling our basic armature today. And by the end of this tutorial, it'll be about this far. In the next tutorial, we'll actually start to work with sort of posing this guy out, choosing your pose, working out the kind of breaks in the body, and then posing it out. So let's begin by working with the larger diameter, the 1/8 inch wire. And I've got it coiled in a way that you should really sort of unravel it, not just by pulling it out like a slinky, but by sort of working it out backwards and unrolling it. And it's going to be sort of an unruly wire at first, but you'll get a feel for almost immediately how easy this stuff is to work. And you need about 30 inches to do the basic body form. That is about the length of your arm, or if you happen to have a tape measure around, I'll just kind of quickly measure out 30 inches. And since you have 5 feet of this stuff, you'll have a lot extra. So if your measurements are off by a little bit, don't worry too much. Even though it sounds really precise, 30 inches, we'll talk 24 inches, 4.5. I'm not so interested in precision at this point. I just gotta throw some kind of number out there, right? So the breaker is usually at the back of most of these tools. Just get a little squeeze, and it really just sort of, you can even kind of see carefully at the end, sort of squeezes the aluminum down until it finally snaps and breaks. Probably a good idea, especially if you're cutting small bits off, that you're careful not to aim the loose end at anybody else. Right? I always like to do my wire breaking while I'm holding both pieces, so if something goes shooting off, I have control over it. We're going to find about the dead center of this piece, and what I like to do is just sort of rough out any awkward bends in here. I like to work with more or less a straight piece. If it has a real jagged end, kind of like to work those jagged ends down. And then we're going to roughly bend that guy in half. And I don't want you to crimp the top so much as I just want you to kind of line up the bottoms here. Now these are not going to be the feet necessarily, because we will be using a sculptural block here at some point. This will actually go down into the block, and so the feet will actually be a little bit higher here, and then we'll find hips somewhere about here. We'll have a torso, and then all of our extra material up here will be used as arms. But here's where we need to do our first measurement. I'm going to use my proportional guide here, and this is a really handy way to sort of kind of imagine this is my sculpture block, and this little bit of wire down here is going to allow me to sort of embed that down into the stand. And then I'll come all the way up here to essentially what's called the crotch, or I'm going to call it sort of just below the iliac crest, that sort of high hip bone. It's the insertion point of your femur. That's about halfway up a human form. It's going to vary depending on your model. In this case, it's about halfway. We're going to stop right about at that X, and that is going to mark for us where the beginning of our torso is. And so I want you to grab that spot with your pliers. Grab both pieces if you can, and we'll begin to twist those together. The first twist can be a little bit tricky. We'll try to make our twists relatively even, but it's not a beauty contest at this point, so don't worry too much about it. This is going to twist together to become essentially what will be the backbone of your character. And we're going to kind of keep the beginning of our torsos pretty even, right about where the insertion of your femur is, the kind of ball joint of your femur, and we'll take this spine all the way to sort of the sort of pit where your two clavicles will come together. That's the base of your neck. That is going to be where our sort of spine of our armature ends. We're not going to go up into the head area. Our 8-inch tall characters aren't going to need all that much support up there. They'll be able to easily hold their heads. If you're going to approach a project where you think it needs a metal armature up into the head for support, we can talk about that and how you might add one. But essentially, I'm going to kind of carefully keep twisting until I hit that spot, and then I'm done. I'm going to stop there. No need to go on any further, and I will break then those two pieces, and you'll see them come out as arms. Okay, so really kind of rough sketch so far of our little character. I'm going to kind of give him some hips now. I'll come straight out with these pieces. And I don't want to make my armature stick out of the clay at all, so I'm going to make sure that he bends his hip down before I get to the outside of the clay. And what I like to do is just sort of use my pliers here to make a nice sharp bend at the hip. That way I don't have to worry about any of my metal armature sticking out of the final clay of the final sculpture. So I've got my sort of middle point. I have my hips. I'm going to use some sort of marker here just at the bottom and roughly mark about where the feet on my guy will be. This isn't super critical, but it's just sort of a visual reminder for me that that is going to be the bottom of my piece, or roughly where these supports will insert into a wooden block. And then I could do something similar with the arms up here. Essentially, I'm going to kind of flex these down and roughly have them in the position where the shoulder is going to insert into the shoulder socket. Now this is not going to be an anatomically correct skeleton. Remember, this is kind of a skeleton, but it's mostly there to sort of show me where an elbow joint is and provide a little structure. So obviously the wire isn't going to do all of that work for me. But now, just in case this little 1/8 inch wire isn't strong enough to fully sort of hold up your piece, we're going to use one more 12-inch piece of wire here and double the legs. That provides an extra little bit of strength. So you should have plenty of this thicker 1/8 inch wire left. You need roughly 1 foot of it. If you don't have a measuring tape, don't worry. Just kind of go a little bit over, and we've got this little extra scrap here, just in case you wanted to work on something else this semester. And I will roughly find my center point. And from there, just sort of follow it right along with my previous piece. Now this doubling is going to kind of perform a couple of functions for me. As I mentioned before, I kind of needed just a little bit more strength out of the legs just in case the clay gets heavy. We're using about 1 pound, maybe a little more of plasticine, or at least that's how much you have available to you. And you know, 1 pound of clay, especially if it's riding really high in your figure's body, could really start to like sag or deform your armature. And so let's not skimp at this point. Let's actually, make sure we have a nice strong piece. And those look good. Obviously I'm a little long here, so I can snip off some of these bottom parts. And now we're going to use the smaller diameter wire as our wrapping wire. Now, if we were just going to start kind of piling clay onto this, I would probably get the clay to stick to my twisted spine pretty well, but the rest of this piece, it's such slippery wire that the clay would just probably fall right off, be kind of a pain to work with. So what we'll do is we'll just do some wrappings using this smaller wire. Use about 24 inches, 2 24-inch sections of it. And we'll wrap the arms separately, then the legs. Let's do about 20 inches for the arms and 24 for the legs because they have to go around a little bit extra stuff. So what I'll do is I'll roughly find right about in the middle, start the pit of the neck again, and keep your windings relatively close together, maybe about a 1/4 inch spaced apart. And keep them nice and tight. That way they'll flex and bend as though they're all the same piece later on. Now if you don't end up right at the end out here where the hand is perfectly, don't worry, these arms are actually a little bit long, very likely, and so we'll end up having to cut some of that off in a moment. But you see how I've got this wrap here. Now the clay is going to bite to that really well. I'm probably using some winding wire that's a little overkill for this task, but it was what we had in the studio, so that's what you guys got. You could use some thinner wire here. The arms aren't going to require quite as much structural support. There's just less clay up there than there is in the body and the legs, and so smaller diameter wire up top wouldn't hurt. And by this point, you're probably noticing all of the black yuck on your hands. Aluminum has sort of a strange quality to it. Everybody says aluminum doesn't rust or doesn't oxidize. It actually does oxidize. It gets a really thin layer of oxidation on the outside, and then it stops, right? It's sort of funny. It's as though like if rust just sort of patinaed the outside of steel, but then stopped, right? Every time you touched it, you'd get yourself a little rusty, but you know, that's kind of what's going on with this aluminum, right? It gets a real thin layer of oxidation on the outside, and then it just sort of stops rusting, I guess, stops oxidizing. And when you rub it and work with it, that's what you're getting all over your hands. So it'll wash off relatively easy, but don't waste your time right in the middle of this project. Let's just kind of get this part done. So I'm going to see if I can hold these two legs in place, my double legs. Maybe I'll hold one side with the pliers while I wrap the other. Just kind of keep things in place. This is when using your third arm, if you've got one, is really handy in the studio. So I'll begin by wrapping up here at the torso, and then make my wrappings about a 1/4 inch apart all the way down the legs. And if it's a little bit funky at first, don't worry. It all sort of comes together as you work down the legs. And remember, it's all going to get wrapped in clay, so if it's not pretty, that's alright. Just try to keep your windings as tight as you can. And I made a little black mark on my leg here earlier. That black mark sort of told me about where my feet were going to be, or about where the insertion point into the sculpture board would be, the sort of deck or the platform that we'll be sculpting on. Take your windings all the way down to the bottom here, and if we need to trim off little bits later on, that is okay. We'll start with a little too much wire, and then we'll back it up. This is especially the case in areas, say, like for example, the ankles. I may have a little too much wire here for, an accurate thin ankle. So we'll see. I may have to kind of work around my armature just a little bit. The same would go for the wrists, right? So I might actually, keep my larger diameter wire trimmed back a little bit, and then keep a little bit of that thinner winding wire that goes all the way out. That way the wrists can stay nice and thin. Okay, so I've pretty much got this guy sculpted. I've got him kind of worked in. He's a bit of a strange stick model. From here, we could just sort of say all of the rest of the work is going to be sort of posing, but maybe the last thing we'll do is just a little bit of measuring and trimming. So grab your calipers, and we're going to take a measurement of the arm and go ahead and do an overall measurement. We can always trim some back later. So overall would be top of the shoulder to the bottom of the fingers, and we're going to measure that out on the model here and trim off the excess wire that you've got. You don't need all that extra wire, and it's just going to make your piece kind of ungangly. That should bring your arm down just below the hip or so, the hand, I should say, just below the arm. And if you want to measure the other one, go for it. I'm just going to bring this one down and roughly cut them to be about the same length. Okay, so those are probably still just a little bit long, but I'm going to keep them a little long for now. And then cut off any other small bits here as I go. Now that piece is ready to travel, and I will join you guys in the next tutorial for a bit of conversation about posing and about getting your armature to bend and break in all the right places. Guys, I'm excited to see how you approach this first project. I'll catch up with you in the studio.